Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Happy Monday. No sane American approves of what Russia has done in Ukraine. We certainly don't, and we don't know anyone who does. On Twitter, you see Democrats pretending that their political opponents are responsible for the invasion and somehow support it. So Joe Biden and his staff so mismanaged the world that Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine after Biden told us for months he could prevent that from happening, and yet all of it is your fault. So that's a slanderous lie. In this country, virtually everyone understands that the invasion of Ukraine is bad. It's bad for us and for the world, and Vladimir Putin is bad too. So effectively in America, those are settled facts. We can stop debating them. The question is, what do we do next? Vladimir Putin's badness doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to think clearly about how to protect this country and the rest of the free world in that order. In fact, Putin's badness makes wise decision-making in the United States more important than ever, and yet at the same time, it makes wise decision-making harder to achieve. It's not easy to see the long view when you're angry. A writer called Tanner Green wrote a piece this morning, which you should read. It's entitled Pausing at the Precipice. Greer began by pointing out that Russia has obviously earned our contempt. Most Americans now despise Vladimir Putin, and that's understandable. They're outraged. But moral outrage is not enough. Moral outrage is not a foreign policy. In fact, Greer writes, moral outrage can be counterproductive. It's clarifying, but here's the downside. Quote, a righteous reaction may be a dangerous one. In the field of power politics, it is outcomes, not intentions, that matter most. Failure to slow down and examine the assumptions and motivations behind our choices may lead to decisions that feel right in the moment, but fail to safeguard our interests, secure our values, or reduce the human toll of war in the long run. Exactly. Nicely put. Another way to express it would be this. Our leaders could easily turn this tragic and volatile moment into an historic disaster. They've done it before. As of tonight, here are the two main things we ought to be worried about going forward. First, and most obviously, this war could get much worse than it already is. We could see many Americans die. Joe Biden is telling us he will not commit American troops to Ukraine. Biden also claimed he opposed vaccine mandates. So is he telling the truth? Even if he is telling the truth about his intentions in this case, Biden can't see the future. Biden has no idea what will happen tomorrow or next week, much less next year. Nobody does. We do know that already many in Washington are pushing for a hot war with nuclear-armed Russia. They're demanding a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That means American forces would shoot down Russian jets in Ukrainian airspace and also take out radar installations and other facilities within Russia itself. Not surprisingly, the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, is on board with this. Why wouldn't he be? He's asked Joe Biden for an American-enforced no-fly zone. But as we said, many in Congress are for it too. Here's Adam Kinzinger.
I think this is time where we need to, at the invitation of Ukraine, declare Ukraine a no-fly zone enforced by NATO and the United States. We certainly have the capability to do that. The airspace is still contested by the Ukrainians. We could certainly shut down Russian air operations even if we don't directly engage Russian troops on the ground.
We can shut down Russian air operations even if we don't directly engage Russian troops on the ground. So that's a lie. It's hard to overstate how dishonest Kinzinger's claim is. Shooting down Russian planes and taking out radar installations would, by definition, entail engaging Russian troops. If Vladimir Putin is even half as evil and crazy as they tell us he is, and he may be, that could easily spiral into nuclear conflict. So you would only suggest that if you had nothing to lose. And Adam Kinzinger, of course, doesn't. His political career is over. He's disgraced. He has literally nothing to lose. But many of us have a lot to lose. Our country, we have children. So we should pause before we do that. But no pausing allowed. Adam Kinzinger thinks you're a traitor if you're worried about where this might go. Quote, this breathlessness over nukes is mind-blowing, Kinzinger wrote over the weekend. Nothing bad will happen. And maybe nothing bad will happen. But something very bad could happen, and it could happen fast. Adults know that. Anyone with experience knows that. Watch any war in history. And yet tonight, amazingly, some of those adults, and they are adults, favor this anyway. Two former Supreme Allied commanders of NATO, Wes Clark and Philip Breedlove, are pushing for armed confrontation with the Russian military. In an interview with Foreign Policy magazine, Breedlove was honest enough to acknowledge that a no-fly zone would amount to, quote, an act of war, and it would. Thank you for saying so out loud. But Breedlove said, he's for it anyway. Okay, so this is the moment when a functioning news media would step in and start to ask basic questions about what happens next. War with Russia, fine. What does that mean exactly? How far is the United States and its population who would fight that war prepared to take this conflict, and to what end? Once we start bombing Russia, will Putin withdraw his forces from Ukraine? What will be left of Ukraine by that point? How are we sure that Putin, who we say is deranged, won't go nuclear if a war with him begins? And then, among many other questions, what will China's role in this war be? Thanks to the efforts of the Biden White House, China is now Vladimir Putin's strongest ally. The Chinese have just signed a long-term energy deal with Russia. They now have skin in the game. Russia will be powering China's economy going forward. Good job, Biden White House. But because that's true, how sure are we that the Chinese will stay out of a war? How do we know they won't take down our digital infrastructure, which they seem to some great extent to control in this country, et cetera, et cetera? You can think of many questions. But reporters aren't asking any of them. Asking questions is now immoral. Richard Engel, who knows better, he's the chief foreign correspondent at NBC, is now demanding that American troops fight the Russian army. It's a moral imperative. Quote, a massive Russian convoy is about 30 miles from Kiev. The US/NATO could likely destroy it, but that would be direct involvement against Russia and risk everything. Does the West watch in silence as it rolls? And of course, the answer is implied. We can't watch in silence. That would be immoral. If you're a good person, you will support a war that could very easily turn into a nuclear conflict. Again, this is moral blackmail. No one in America takes pride at the sight, feels anything but revulsion at the sight of Russian troops within Ukraine. It's wrong. It's destabilizing to the world. It is, in fact, against our values. But how we respond is the question. Thoughtfully has to be the answer, unless we're prepared to risk massive consequences.
Olá pessoal, tudo bem? Aqui é o Tradutor. Eu tô passando para te avisar que eu tô numa campanha para conseguir pelo menos mais 9 apoiadores. Esse canal não é monetizado, então totalmente depende de você. Eu preciso muito do seu apoio para manter esse canal atualizado e vivo, né, no ar. Os links para apoiar esse nosso projeto estão na descrição desse vídeo e no comentário fixado. Então é muito fácil e muito simples de apoiar. É graças a essas pessoas incríveis que eu posso estar trazendo conteúdo para vocês. E é isso aí, pessoal. Não se esqueçam de deixar seu like, seu comentário e até mais. Fui! Grande abraço.